Thanks for joining us for You're All Doomed, the podcast that cleaves its way through Friday the 13th Part 2, 13 minutes at a time. I'm Greg, disgraced ex-frontman of the Smokey Boys Band.
And I'm just Brian.
And this chunk begins with the final appearances of Pamela Voorhees and ends with the closing Paramount logo. Ginny still has Jason eating out of the palm of her hand. He's convinced that he's seeing the resurrected form of his deceased mother and that she is praising him for the course of revenge that he has enacted upon all of the people who caused her death.
Yeah, and Jason's starting to suspect that something is up. You know, he thinks it's his mother, but he's not so sure.
Yeah, he's just not quite trusting his own judgment almost.
Yeah, and so he kind of like snaps out of it for a second, and he quickly raises his pickaxe like he's going to, strike it toward Ginny. And she gets really stern with him, and she goes, "Jason, Mother is talking to you." And Jason gets all submissive, and he's like, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry." And he starts to actually kneel down in front of her, and Ginny encourages him to do so. And
Yep. That was a nice touch on her part, and I like that they even had Betsy Palmer record that same stern, reprimand, and so then Jason falls for it hook, line, and sinker until Ginny makes the mistake of moving slightly to get a better angle to get him with the machete. She moves just a little bit too far to one side, so Jason is able to see behind her and sees that the severed head is still on the altar and that the sweater is gone and is not where it's supposed to be. So that snaps him right out of it. And I really love, even though it's just his eye through the bag, you can see the look of dawning rage on his face as he realizes that he's been tricked.
Yeah, he looks at the severed head and then looks up at Ginny and is just kind of like, "You son of a bitch."
Yeah, it's great. And she goes for it with the machete, but he deflects it with the head of his pickaxe. And Ginny gets her first major wound. She gets a pretty nasty gash on her leg.
Yeah, I imagine that kind of cut through some muscle and probably did not feel very good.
Yeah, that's a pretty brutal injury. And then Paul miraculously appears.
Yeah, when he disappeared in the previous scene, even that was a little ambiguous. We were in a room and he just suddenly didn't appear anymore. And so I don't know, he was probably knocked out in the shadows or something and just didn't get up. But yeah, he barges into the room and does this really awkward. He goes, "Ginny!" And it's supposed to be this heroic entry, but it just comes off a little...
Yeah, it sounds like he's got a stomach cramp or something. Yeah. There's a little bit of a warble
like he got
in his
punched
voice.
in the stomach as soon as he said Ginny.
Yeah. And I wonder how the hell he found them.
Really quickly.
He wouldn't even know which direction to run in, but unless he happened to come to and see them run off into the woods. But yeah, that was sort of another example of Paul teleporting a little bit too conveniently. So they resume their wrestling match. Paul and Jason begin tussling again, and Jason's back is now to Ginny. And she has enough wherewithal, despite her new leg wound, to bury the machete deep into his shoulder. It's a pretty devastating cut. That thing is...
Yeah, it's right in the nape of his neck. And
it's buried the width of the blade. That thing is embedded in his shoulder.
There's tendons, there's bone, all that way. Jason he's hurting.
He's carved up. And he does a fairly amusing keel over backwards, kind of like he's kind of teetering on his knees, and then just kind of freezes and then topples over backwards, and it's pretty humorous. But it looks like she's taking care of Jason. So she's now rescued Paul. They kind of take a moment to stand up and confirm that each other is okay. But the first thing Ginny should do is take off that sweater. But she leaves it on, and instead the first thing they do is take off Jason's bag.
Is that something that you would even be curious about? Like if someone wearing a pillowcase, potato sack, whatever, was attacking you and you got the best of them, would you be inclined to want to take the sack off and see who it was, or would you just want to get out of there?
I would get the hell out of there and worry about that later. I think it's consistent with her, given that we had a pretty lengthy sequence of her expounding on her theories about Jason. I can see where her curiosity would be too much for her, and she would just want to see, like, was I right about this boy? And it was probably foolish, but I can understand why that character did that.
Well, earlier we had asked each other why we thought Jason might wear a sack, and based on Paul and Ginny's reaction after taking off the sack, I think we know why. They're both pretty disgusted by what they see.
Yeah, obviously he's not a nice looking dude. I mean, we saw a little, flashbacks of him as a kid, and he was weird looking, but they look like they're horrified by what they find under that bag.
Yeah, I think they immediately regretted the decision of taking the sack off. Like, oh, this was a bad idea.
Yeah.
That's going to haunt me for life.
So they kind of hobble out of the shack, and I like how casually Pam's sweater is removed and thrown onto the ground as they exit the building.
So remind me to come back to that a little bit later, because I have an observation about that.
Yeah, I mean, I like to imagine that it's still laying there, but yeah, we'll come back to that. I got a kick out of the fact that they stumble through the puddle that's apparently just outside Jason's shack. So that's like the third or fourth time we've seen that puddle, and I'm tempted to see if you and I can go find that puddle. Right. It's kind of iconic at this point. But they managed to shamble their way back to the cabin. I think at some point finally Paul actually picks her up and carries her because of her injured leg, so very gallant of him.
It took me a little bit of time to figure it out where exactly they were, but it's the same cabin from earlier where Ginny had attacked Jason with the chainsaw.
Okay.
So
there's piss all over the floor.
Yeah, and I just wanted to. I was trying to figure out where they were. Not that it helps from a geographic standpoint, but I was, I didn't know how many cabins there were. But for whatever reason, they ended up back at that cabin.
Okay. So they're in the room and they're starting to kind of settle down, but they hear some scratching at the door, and so they're immediately alarmed and they're like, "Oh shit, it's not over yet." So Ginny takes the pokey end of the broken pitchfork that was laying on the floor. Paul takes the handle end, which, I mean, I think it was years before I realized what he was holding. I don't know that I ever got a good look at it because of VHS quality or something, but I didn't know what it was until I saw the pitchfork break this time.
Yeah, I don't remember the pitchfork breaking until this time around, and so I'm with you. I probably thought it was like a broom handle or something. I'm like, dude, she's got a pitchfork and you got a broom handle? Who's going to win this battle here? But it's the only thing they had around. Although, whatever happened to the chainsaw?
Well, remember, it stalled, so she couldn't get it started again. I mean, I think it might have even been outside at that point. So Ginny, because she's injured, she's resting on the bed in front of the window, and Paul is, approaching the door slowly, and they're kind of communicating non-verbally to each other. And I really like when Paul gets to the doorknob, he pauses and he looks back at her to see if she's ready. And I really like her determined nod, like, okay, yeah, let's do this.
Yeah, like she gives her like a couple of seconds to like psych herself up, and she just kind of like almost like takes a deep breath, and like you said, gives them this nod, like, all right, bring it on, let's open the door.
Yeah, that's a great moment. But he opens the door and it's Muffin.
Yeah.
Oh, Muffin's alive.
Thank God. I don't know about you, but I've been just so concerned about where Muffin has been. And I'd love to know what she's been up to. I mean, there should be like, another movie or something about the adventures of Muffin.
Oh, like Milo and Otis, but just with Muffin on a solo adventure.
Exactly.
I mean, I wish Paul would go ahead and smack Muffin with the pitchfork handle until she looks like the dog carcass that we saw earlier. I hate that little fucking top knot with the little ribbon.
Oh, it's hideous.
Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of Muffin.
Now there's some nice, sweet music playing, and it's very calm and serene. We know that Muffin is alive, and Paul is okay, and Ginny is okay, and Jason is dead, and I think everything's just going to be...
Oh my God, Jason bashed through the window!
Oh my God.
Oh my God, he's been behind Ginny, and he bashes through the window. Yeah, so he's still got the machete embedded in his shoulder.
But he's not wearing the sack on his head.
And he probably should go back to wearing the sack.
Yeah, because he's
kind of a mess.
Not a handsome fella.
Yeah, I mean, the right side of his head looks like the Toxic Avenger, The left side of his head looks like Dave Mustaine. So he's kind of a hodgepodge going on there. And it's like he's got this flowing mane of hair on one side of his head. A droopy eye we've seen before. But then the other side is bald and kind of mottled and looks like maybe he was burned at some point.
It kind of looks like he could be related to the Hound from Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah, that's a good call. He's a Clegane. I like it.
Yeah, it's a very strange kind of deformity where, like you were saying, he's got the hair on one side but not on the other, and he's got a pretty serious wonky eye, and yeah, there's something going on there. So this is all kind of in slow motion, but as Jason is crashing through the window, he manages to put his arms around Ginny and pull her out through the window. And once again, we get our famous, dissolve to a bright white screen.
Yeah, we blast fade to Ginny then laying on a gurney. There are medical professionals around. Obviously, the authorities have somehow been alerted. And she's being loaded into an ambulance and cared for. But she's calling for Paul. She's asking, where's Paul? And no one answers her. She's loaded into the ambulance. The doors are shut and it drives away. And we never really learn what Paul's fate was.
Right, because, the last scene was this slow motion shot. Paul and Ginny were in the room. Ginny gets pulled out of the window by Jason. And that's it. We have no idea what happened to Paul, and neither does Ginny. And the EMTs clearly don't give a shit because they're not responding.
Right. So I think Paul teleported away.
Yeah. I mean, they don't even bother closing the doors on the ambulance before it drives away. There's like a guy, one of the EMTs is back there trying to like frantically close the door as it's driving down the road.
Yeah.
I do have a quick question for you about this scene, and we'll have to bring it up in the conclusion of this question will be in the next season. But during this moment where Ginny's being wheeled into the stretcher, did you happen to see any like camera crews or news reporters around filming all of this taking place?
No.
Okay.
It looked like it was mainly just first responders.
Okay, just curious. Good to know.
Yeah. So the movie itself ends on a shot of the altar back in Jason's shack, where Mrs. Voorhees' head is still in its resting place. And then the screen fades to credits. So Paul's fate is truly left up in the air. And despite reading and watching documentaries and behind-the-scenes footage and stuff, I'm very unclear as to what the intention was ultimately. I know that they had filmed or intended to film a version of this where Mrs. Voorhees' eyes open and she smiles at the camera, which is meant to allude to the fact that Jason killed Paul. I don't really see how that is accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine a movie like a Friday the 13th movie or Jason Voorhees movie in particular where the ending involves a decapitated head like winking or smiling at the camera? Can you imagine something as absurd as that?
That seems like the worst possible idea.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine we would ever see something like that in another movie. But yeah, I'd heard that too about the alternate ending. It is very bizarre that they leave it so open-ended, and I don't know if it's just an error, and they thought they were going to put something in there that resolved it, or if they just intentionally left it open. But we have no idea what happened to Paul.
Yeah, and that's kind of unfair to the character because I did like him a lot, John Fury, the actor, kind of responded to rumors that it was because he had a falling out with the director Steve Miner, and he says that's not true at all. It was, it was just kind of the way things worked out. That he had a great time working with Steve Miner and had a great time on the set and stuff. So I think it's just kind of maybe an oversight / we figured nobody was going to care. Nobody was going to watch this movie 800 times.
Yeah,
nobody was going to break it into 13-minute chunks and talk about it, 30 years later. So, but it's a shame. And, maybe leaves the door open for Paul to come back someday. That'd be kind of cool.
Yeah. Earlier, I had mentioned you had talked about how when Ginny walks out of Jason's shack, she takes off the sweater. And even viewing it this time, I never picked up on that fact that she took the sweater off. And so I had this crazy realization on this viewing where when I saw Ginny being wheeled away wearing a blue shirt, my first thought was, holy shit, Jason pulled Ginny through the window just to get his mother's sweater back. And that's why she survived. He's like, no, the only thing that's important to me is to get my mother's sweater back. And so he pulls her through, takes the sweater, and that's why she had the blue shirt on. So I had to go back and watch it, and then I realized, and it's pretty quick and subtle, but as she's walking out, she's already halfway out of the sweater, and she just kind of like doffs it off to the side of the door. But I had this brief moment where I'm like, holy shit, did I just discover this potential alternate theory for why Ginny survives?
Which would be great, because as it is, there is no real explanation for why.
Right,
Ginny
like how she got away. Yeah.
Presumably Paul fought Jason off again, but yeah, that would have been pretty cool.
There's also some theories that suggest that Jason jumping through the window is a dream sequence, but I don't believe it is. Like the muffin sequence is truly the end of the movie, and then for some reason they dream.
They're doing another, hallucination thing.
Yeah, I don't buy that. I think it really did happen, and because if it makes a little bit more sense that she and Paul would have been separated and therefore not wheeled out on ambulances together. So like you have to separate them somehow, and that's why I believe Jason really did come through the window and grab her. It just would have been kind of cool if he was just trying to get the sweater back.
Yeah, I would have liked that. That's cool. So we pretty much jump into the end credits here. We'll cover Steve Miner in a future season because he actually comes back to direct another movie. But we can kind of begin to talk about Amy Steele, who played Ginny Field, and I one of my favorite appearances, well after I had seen this movie, was an episode of Family Ties where she showed up as a character who actually takes Alex Keaton's virginity. She plays a college girl that he spends a night with, and that's his first time. And I could totally see being a teenage boy and falling just enough in love with a girl who looked like her to want her to be my first boy.
Alex P. Keaton's one lucky bastard.
He's one lucky guy. But she seems like a pretty good sport about being in these flicks too. She's participated in some fan stuff and been on documentaries, and she's thrown out the fun idea of having like a reappearance as Ginny. She was actually at one point going to be coming back for the third movie, but the deal fell through with her agent, so that sadly didn't work out. But given what happened to Adrienne King's character, maybe it's for the best that Ginny didn't come back. Otherwise, she might have been killed off. So,
I made a joke at Jamie Lee Curtis's expense earlier, but I do wonder why Jamie Lee Curtis kind of has the reputation of being this, incredible scream queen. Not to say that she didn't do a great job. She absolutely did. But I think Amy Steele did a fantastic job, and I don't think she's nearly as recognized.
Yeah, that's probably because this movie isn't as well regarded, even culturally. I would argue that it's just as scary and just as well made as Halloween on some levels. There's a little bit more artistry, I think, to John Carpenter's movies that maybe elevates the Halloween franchise, or at least the first one. And it really did kind of pave the way for movies like this. So Jamie Lee might benefit from being the first of the slasher movie scream queens to some extent. But yeah, you're right. I mean, Amy Steele was great, and I like this movie a lot. I mean, I actually probably enjoy it more than I enjoy Halloween, as much as I admire the first Halloween movie. But yeah, I would like to see Amy Steele be more renowned for her performance, but I guess that's not necessarily what people look to these movies for. And maybe Jamie Lee also benefits from having pretty excellent acting credits beyond Halloween.
Yeah.
And Amy Steele hasn't necessarily had anything that was a breakout role for her, but she was great. And I thought John Fury was really good as Paul Holt. He's actually done a ton of work. He's been on a lot of TV shows, and is still active today. So I kind of, knowing that, I hope I see him on a show sometime, and I wonder if I'll recognize him right off the bat, because this is the only thing I've ever actually seen him in that I'm aware of. But he's been on enough stuff that I'm sure I've seen him elsewhere and just didn't realize it.
It makes me Amy Steele makes me want to watch April Fool's Day.
Oh, that's right.
I don't know how big of a role she plays in that, but when I saw that she was in another slasher flick, I think maybe even the year after this one, it makes me kind of want to see her in action again to see how she
I'd be up for that.
Pulls it off.
We'll do April Fool's Minute.
It sounds like a plan.
And then the other major credit that introduces a little bit of discussion is who is credited as Jason. It's an interesting story because for years, I mean, the person who is credited in the roll call as playing Jason is an actor named Warrington Gillette, and he was the first person whose name I knew as a guy who played Jason. Most people know Kane Hodder. A lot of people know people who have played the role subsequently, but Warrington Gillette was the first. Like, oh man, I know who. Jason was played by Warrington Gillette. But it turns out that he didn't really play Jason that much, beyond the scene where Jason leaps through the window.
Yeah, I think that's the only one, like the unmasked scene.
Yeah, Jason's actually played by, he's credited as Jason's stunt double, but Steve Dash played most of what we see of Jason running around and killing people. So it's kind of an interesting shared credit, and I kind of get the vibe that it's a little bit contentious, that, some people resent how much credit Warrington Gillette takes for his portrayal, but I can't really weigh in on that too much. I think both of them did a great job with the scenes they shot, and I was happy to learn that Steve Dash did contribute so much to that character and took some of those hard falls. So he unfortunately passed away recently, but I appreciate his contributions. I haven't seen Warrington Gillette pop up too much since this role, but yeah, some good stuff.
One thing I noticed in the credits was the animals and that were featured in the movie. So basically, the cat that was thrown through the window at Alice's house, and Muffin, and hopefully not the carcass that we found on the path earlier in the movie, but they were all owned and
the
trained.
Original Muffin.
Right. They were all owned and trained by a place called Dawn Animal Control Agency, and it's in New York. They're still in business, and they've been providing professional animals to the media since 1959. So that seems like kind of a cool company to work for. You're like, oh, you need a dog? You need a cat? Where are your guys?
I'm going to call them and see if I can get Muffin in my remake of my fan film of another Friday the 13th movie.
I don't know how to break this to you, Greg, but I don't think Muffin's still around.
We saw Muffin at the end; she's alive.
Yeah, we'll talk later.
Okay. The only other credit that jumped out at me was the location auditor, Pumpkin Payroll Service.
Nice.
Which I looked up because I would love to work there and have that on my business card, but it appears they are no longer around. So thanks anyway, Pumpkin Payroll.
What is a location auditor? Is that someone that shows up and goes, yep, this is a camp? Or is it like an auditor that is on location?
I think it's an auditor that is on location. If they're a payroll service, I'm guessing that they were, accounting, representation, and probably making sure that all the crew members got their stipend and stuff like that.
It would have been a lot cooler if it was just someone that verifies that the location is actually a location and then walks away.
Yeah, agreed. Especially if they hand out pumpkins while they're there.
Right.
So I think that's all I've got for Friday the 13th Part 2, at least the actual on-screen footage.
Yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot more in this one than Part 1. There was a lot of notes to take, and Part 1 was very front-loaded with character introductions, and then a lot of just long runs through the woods. But this one was a lot of work, a lot of things to keep up with, and a lot of fun things to keep an eye on.
Yeah, agreed. We'll see where we go from here. But thank you very much for listening to this season. We've got one more bonus episode coming up to talk about some bigger picture issues, and then we'll close down until our take on Friday the 13th Part 3. So thanks again for joining us. I've been Greg.
And I've been Brian.
And you're all doomed.
You're all doomed.